These are the tools I will be using to make a skirt sloper from the torso sloper. And the yellow piece of paper is a list of measurements for my model that I will go over in a moment. I know that the finished skirt will be about 23 inches, so I'm cutting about 26, 28 inches of paper. And first I'm just penciling in the waistline and the dart. And remember, this is not a true fisheye dart because it doesn't have a bottom ending. It goes to the hip. So the skirt sloper needing a normal dart, I'm going to have to take some of the ease or the fullness away of the hip area from the torso sloper. Otherwise the skirt would be much too wide. You'll better understand this as I work through it. So I'm comparing how much is taken in at the hip area from the transition of the sloper of the torso to the skirt. And I need to take about half of that away. It'll be easier if I just work with the single layer. First, I'm creating the line in the middle of the dart. And I'm making the dart about 5 inches long, and that will have an end to it. It'll be a normal waist to the hip or hip area dart. And you can understand now that what is below that tip on the skirt, if you look at the torso, there's much more intake. So I need to subtract that from the hip area. So I'm going to subtract about ½ of an inch, not at the waist, but from the waist to the hip. Now I'm going to come straight down. This is really a straight skirt, but it's not a tapered skirt that's tight to the legs. There'll be plenty of walking room. The reason I didn't take in a whole inch is because we still need ease in the skirt, where the torso sloper is pretty much close to the body and would not give a lot of ease for movement. Erasing the original line from the torso sloper, hip to waist. And now I'm measuring the length of the skirt on the side seam. This skirt I want to be about 23 inches long. And I'll give it a 2-inch hem. This ruler, being 2 inches wide, is perfect to use for this measurement, making a line perpendicular from center front and then 2 inches below for the hem allowance. I'm giving it a 1-inch seam allowance for the time being. I just want to make sure that the skirt muslin is a good fit, and then if I want to keep 1 inch in the fashion fabric, fine. If not, I can always make it less, like a 3/4 inch seam allowance. You can see the 1/2-inch extension. In other words, comparing the hip area from the torso sloper to this new skirt sloper. The torso sloper at the hip extends 1/2 inch. That shows that I have eliminated that in the skirt. Making a cross grain at the hip line. And cutting off the excess. Using a dry iron, no steam, I can flatten this paper. Now to true the dart, I'm folding on the line closest to the center front and folding the dart shut. It takes a little practice to learn to handle paper like this, but you'll get used to it easily and quickly. Pin the dart shut. A right angle at center front. using my curve to make a nice line from the center front to the side seam. This one's shaped a little differently. Adding seam allowance, 1/2 of an inch. And cutting on the edge, top edge of the seam allowance with the dart pinned shut. This will give you the proper shape at the top of the dart. This is called truing. Now to put notch marks at the top of the darts. Going over it with a stronger pencil so it's more obvious, and then I'll do the notches. I'm starting the curve at the bottom of the dart and using the same number that is on the curve from left to right side so that the shapes of the curves are exactly the same on both sides. And now here are the notches. I usually do them in red. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so my notches will be marked about 1/4 inch long. A notch at center front, at the side seam, at the hip, putting the amount of the seam allowance in the side seam, writing center front or CF, and I always put it right on the exact center front, not out in the pattern someplace, because it can be confusing if someone else uses your pattern. And now to work with the back sloper to make the skirt back sloper in paper. Now if you notice, the dart at the waist to hip on the torso sloper comes to a point. This was not extended to the bottom of the sloper. The front is extended because of the bust. You need that. The bust, from the bust to the waist is so much that you need to take it all the way in. In most cases, you have to take it all the way to the hip. So I'm tracing just like I did the front. I aligned the center backs of torso sloper and paper. I'm tracing the waist and hip onto the paper, tracing the dart, writing center back or CB right on the edge of the paper. measuring the width at the fullest part of the hip and creating a line straight down parallel to center back. Filling in the dart. Holding the leg of the dart closest to the center back and pulling it across to fold the dart. This is as if you were pressing the fabric or the dart. It would be pressed towards center back. So you fold it towards center back to true it. Going over the waistline with a darker marker, a right angle at center back, adding my 1/2 inch seam allowance for the waistline. I want to match the side seams at the waist. And pin those together. That's not including seam allowance. Making the side seams right on top of each other to check the length of the skirt and also the width. Putting in the seam allowance for the back. If you cut this way with them stacked, you'll be more accurate. The lengths will be exactly the same, and I can put the hip or the grain lines at the hip on top of each other as well, so things will be very professional. Filling in the hip line, also cross grain. Marking the hip and the model's name. Putting in my notches, hip, side seam, darts, you can see the difference. The smaller one is on top, it's the back, and usually the front is a little bit wider. Usually a ½ inch if it's a half pattern like this. That gives a full inch for the front of the skirt. In other words, the front of the skirt is often an inch wider than the back. That's because the high hip, about 3 or 4 inches below the waist, sticks out. And you need that extra width of the skirt to accommodate that. If a person's behind is super big, then you change this. Now I need to add seam allowance to the center back. I could have done this in the beginning. I simply forgot. I'm going to give 1 inch for seam allowance down center back. It's good to put tape on both sides simply because if you put it on one side, the other side tends to catch on things and rip easily. This makes it much more secure. Marking my center back in red. It's also my length grain line. Oops. Center back. Writing the seam allowance in. This notch is at the hip. It's also often used to indicate the bottom of a zipper. Zippers on skirts are usually 7 to 8 inches long. If a person is rather large, you use a longer zipper. Just checking to make sure my links are all perfect. Marking the hem with a notch. Both layers, front and back. Trimming off any excess. Now, side seams together. A 2-inch hem. Now this yellow piece of paper has my model's measurements. Her waistline is 29¼ inches, and I also have the measurements of front and back. I'm measuring the front of this pattern without the dart and doubling it to compare to my measurement of 15¼ Now I'm measuring the back, excluding seam allowances and darts, and comparing to the paper. In other words, you take the measurement of the body around the entire waist, and then from side seam to side seam across the front and back. When you have the front full measurement, you divide it by 2, and that's what the skirt will be on the front sloper without seam allowance or dart, and the same on the back. And now I need to cut muslin and cut this out and put it together for our model.